all of those things at the same time. And so in order to destroy these old narrative modes, I had to destroy in myself my own habits of thought, which meant I had to put myself in the book too. And that's what resulted in the shape of the thing, which is part history, part reportage, and part memoir.
Well, one aspect of not just talking about things in terms of tragedy and flattening things out, something you touch on is how Indian children were conscripted into American government-run boarding schools in the early 20th century. And I've heard a bit about this, and I've read a bit about this on forced assimilation, and it's rightly portrayed as this tragedy where culture is flattened out, but then that's where the story ends. It is something that American society has to deal with as a dark part of its past. But then you mentioned at the end that this helps construct a pan-Indian identity, which I thought was very interesting. So could you talk about these government schools and how it leads to this network among different tribes?
After 1890, there were a couple things that occurred, one after the other, but there was a lot of overlap. One was the passage of legislation known as the Dawes Act, which terminated communal ownership of tribal land and assigned individual parcels to individual people. The idea being that private property and the ownership of property is really the gateway drug to being civilized. And the net effect of that program was to unland Native people. And I forget the exact numbers. It's in the book, but I forget how many millions of acres, but the majority of Native lands remaining in 1890 passed out of Native control. I think something like 85% of the land we controlled in 1890 was gone from us by 1920. During the same period, the government started what it thought of as a beneficial program of Indian education in the form of residential Indian boarding schools. Kids from tribes across the country were removed from their homes, sometimes by force, often coerced. So if you wouldn't give up your kid voluntarily, they would withhold rations, they would withhold food and clothing and blankets, the things you needed to survive. They would bar you from employment. They would do all sorts of things to get your kids and then bring them to these boarding schools where these Native children were forbidden from speaking their native languages. They were forbidden from practicing their native religions. Their hair was cut. Their clothing was destroyed and it was replaced with uniforms and white man's clothing, etc. The point was to destroy tribes, which again were seen as an impediment to civilization. The goal was to destroy tribes by destroying families. And in many ways, those schools were as traumatic as we can imagine. There was rampant abuse, physical, sexual, certainly psychological and mental. There were all sorts of traumas associated with being ripped from your family and without any idea of when you might see them again. And that's sort of the story we tell about boarding schools. But a lot of people who went to these schools said it was okay. It was just what had to happen, and they had an okay time. It wasn't as bad as people think. But one of the other things that people don't talk about are all these unintended side effects. So all these kids from tribes that may have for centuries been at war with one another were shoved in these schools together, suffered the same indignities together, and formed bonds over their shared experience. And kids from tribes previously unknown to one another had the same experience. So when they were out of school and they were out in the world and they moved back to their reservations often and began working in government and tribal government, they discovered that they had a network of people they knew across the country who had similar understandings and shared experience. And they used those understandings and experience to build networks that strengthened tribal sovereignty during the era of tribal self-determination and self-governance governance in the 1930s and 40s. And it's even all these crazy connections happen on personal levels too. So when I was at the Blackfeet Nation doing interviews, I got a chance to talk to this very old teepee maker named Nomi Campbell. And she is this amazingly talented teepee maker. I don't know how she does it. That canvas is heavy and she's tiny, but she does it. She's beautiful. We're chatting and she said, "Where are you from again?" I said, "Well, I'm from Leech Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota." She says, "Oh yeah, Leech Lake. He said, do you know the village of Ball Club? And I said, sure. Ball Club is the next village down the road from my family's village, which is Bena, maybe 15 miles apart. She said, do you know Alan Wilson? And I said, yeah, I know Alan. He's dead now, but he was one of my dad's best friends for years. And she said, yeah, so he married my sister. I said, wait. Ida is your sister? And she said, yeah, Ida's my sister. I said, Ida's Blackfeet? She's not Ojibwe? She said, no, she's Blackfeet. I said, what the hell? Where did they meet? Boarding school? She said, yep, they met at Flandreau Indian boarding school. And so it's just one example and a really funny one that I knew her sister and I hadn't even known that she wasn't even Ojibwe. And I'd known her since I was a baby. And so these are some of the ways that boarding schools kind of tied our tribes together in previously untied ways, I guess.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. Right, and at the same time that this is happening, then there's the participation of the Native adult population in World War II. So you mentioned that this isn't the first war, obviously, that American Indians had served in, but there's something different about World War II and its effect on the population. What influence does that have on it?
What influence did World War II have on Native lives? Is that the question?
Right.
World War II was huge, and this is the thing. This is one of the problems I think with the study and practice of American Indian history is that we tend to treat it as separate from American history. But I don't think you can understand American Indian history in the 20th century without putting it in relation to, for example, African American history. And just as African Americans underwent the great migration from rural southern communities to northern urban communities during and after the First World War and up through the Second World War, American Indian communities were experiencing the same thing. Native people were involved in all sorts of diasporas in the 20th century that brought us from reservations, not just to cities, but to suburbs and small towns across the country. And World War II was also a big part of that. One thing about the Native experience of both the First and Second World Wars was that we were not in segregated units. American Indian soldiers served in integrated mixed units with Anglo soldiers, and then in World War II, Latino soldiers. And this was profound. And ironically, a lot of the natives who served in the First World War served at higher pay grades and at higher ranks than their non-Indian peers because they had gone to vocational school in those boarding schools. Those boarding schools were largely vocational, so they got better paying jobs as sawyers and cobblers and gunsmiths and blacksmiths and so on, which put you at a higher pay grade than someone who had no skills and went into the infantry, for example. But so one of the effects of that service was to put natives in contact with all sorts of other people, to create skills that they then brought back to their communities. The chairman of Red Lake Reservation, who was chairman for about 30 years, a guy named Roger Jourdain, he was a heavy equipment operator in the Army and helped build the Trans-Canada Highway. He didn't see combat during the Second World War, but he gained incredible experience not only operating heavy machinery, but with institutional structure, with business practices, with accounting, with all sorts of things. Another guy from Red Lake Reservation, a guy named Eugene Stillday, was a Korean War veteran, and he used the GI Bill to get an accounting degree. And he brought that experience and expertise to bear on his role in tribal government and in his community for years afterwards. So those are just some of the ways that being in the Army in both the First and Second World War affected Native people.
And after it ends, a lot of American Indians, moved to urban areas. And I'm from Kansas City, and you can still see the effects of redlining on American Indians all over the place, where when people are buying a new home, they see the original title and it has the history of all the owners, and it includes documentation going back to the 1940s, and it explicitly states that it cannot be sold in certain communities to African Americans, to American Indians, I think it even mentions Armenians. So that's really getting down there in different racial groups. So talk about this too, the urbanization of American Indian life. Again, I think something that is left out of this narrative. How does that affect American Indian culture?
Sure. I don't know how it affects American Indian culture because there are 320 roughly federally recognized tribes in the United States. That's
Right.
320 different cultures and experiences. And if you're Dene, which is to say Navajo, and you move to Phoenix or Los Angeles, well, I don't know how that's going to play out compared to being Ojibwe and moving to Chicago or to Minneapolis, for example.
Right.
So there's a lot of diversity in experience. Some people I talked to for the book, some Blackfeet people, again, their family was moved down to Los Angeles and didn't like it and were here only 2 years before they moved back. Other people moved and they got the job training and the vocational training that the government promised, and they got great work as steel workers or heavy equipment operators or construction workers and made a life in cities and quite happily. And in the 60s or 50s and 60s, joined the American middle class. I mean, there are many Indians who did that too. So there's just a whole range of experiences, but one of the overall effects might have been that whether or not the dominant culture noticed this at all, we were interacting with, experiencing, mastering, and implementing all of the vices and virtues of modernity and bending them to our own purpose. So while there may have been some great divide between someone who was, as we say, res-raised and someone who was raised in the city, that might have been true at some earlier point in time. Now there's so much traffic back and forth. People move to the city and they move back, or people grew up in the city, then they move to the reservation for the first time, then they go back to the city. There's all this movement and pollination and cross-pollination that I think makes our communities stronger.
What you're trying to do with your book is, of course, not just create something for people to remember, but you're saying that history didn't simply end for American Indians, but it's something to draw inspiration from as people move forward in their lives. And that you say for Indians to move forward, they must find a way not to leave their past behind. How would you describe this of moving forward, and how would an American Indian dream differ from a general American dream? How would they be similar? How would they be different?
I talk about that later in the book, but to the first part of your question, what did Marx say? Marx said something to the effect of all men make history, but not always with tools of their choosing. Or I think in the translation I put in the book, not always as they please. We make history with what we have. And so that's one thing I want the book to do. I want the book to catch us in the act of making our own history. There is this tendency to view history as merely the sum of the injustices that Indians have managed to survive. And that's all. And I wanted to write a book that suggested that we've been making history as best we can and with the tools at our disposal for a long time. And the other big thing I really wanted the book to accomplish was something we already talked about, which is I didn't want to just flip the script. I wanted to find a new narrative to use for us to tell these stories. And maybe I've read too much Hayden White back in the day, but the manner of the telling shapes not just what's told, but what's possible to tell. That words and narrative shape the world. It's in many ways as simple as that, and that's necessarily political. And the third thing I really wanted the book to do was to point out something I believe to be true, which is you can't really understand this country at all. You can't take its temperature. You can't take its measure unless you consider American Indian history as American history. I mean, let's look back. One of the very first American acts, the dumping of tea in Boston Harbor, wasn't a moment in which people simply ran onto ships and dumped tea in the harbor. They dressed up as Mohawk Indians and then dumped tea in the harbor. From the very beginning, American Indians have